Everybody to the annual public lecture of the Conceptual Foundations of Conflict Project. I'm Mark Schroeder, and for those of you who don't know, the Conceptual Foundations of Conflict Project is a group on campus whose mission is to encourage and promote philosophical work that helps to shed light on the nature, structures, sources, dynamics, and consequences of interpersonal conflict at all stages. So we have different kinds of events, we have working groups, we sponsor different kinds of events on campus. And part of the goal is to encourage philosophers to spend more time thinking about the kinds of issues that are going to help us to understand all kinds of conflicts and ways that understandings of philosophy can escape philosophy in the field and the academy, and to bring other ideas into philosophy that's supposed to think about ways that philosophy can be more practical and more useful. And so today is part of our series of public lectures, and so I'm delighted to have my colleague John Kwong introduce today's speaker.
So I am delighted to be able to introduce our guest today, David Shoemaker. Dave is professor of philosophy at the Sage School of Philosophy at Cornell, and as many of you will already know, Dave is one of the leading figures in the world working on responsibility and agency. He's produced an amazing body of work in moral philosophy more generally. Dave is the author of 3 monographs, by my count, more than 60 academic papers, and he also edits the very influential Oxford Studies in Agency and Responsibility series. Dave's work has been incredibly and justly influential, particularly his work on responsibility, which culminated, you might say, with his book, Responsibility at the Margins, published in 2015. That book is already a cornerstone for work on agency and responsibility, and has done a lot to reshape the way philosophers think about how we should approach issues of agency and responsibility, paying more attention to real world cases of people who might not fit the stereotype of how philosophers have traditionally thought about agency. On top of all that, Dave is also an incredible, phenomenal academic citizen. He is the co-founder, many years ran the academic website eSoup, which, as many of you know, has become the central place online for sustained, serious discussion of work in moral, political, and legal philosophy. He served in the demanding role of associate editor at Ethics for more than 6 years, and he regularly organizes and hosts an incredible, mind-boggling number of academic events, maybe most notably the New Orleans Workshop of Agency and Responsibility. I don't think it's an exaggeration. I really don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Dave has maybe done as much, if not more, than any other living moral philosopher to create and sustain a variety of inclusive and friendly and welcoming, but also intellectually demanding venues where people can present and discuss their work. And for that, as well as for many other things, we owe Dave an enormous amount of gratitude. So with that, please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Dave.
Thank you, John. That was overwhelmingly undeserved. I really appreciate that, and I really appreciate the invitation to be here and to talk to you all about this new kind of project that I've been working on. And Mark's exactly right. For something like this, I'm thinking, what can I say about conflict and conflict resolution? And so it has spurred me to think more about it. I've got a book that's just come out called Wisecracks, and it's about how humor and morality interact. And so I'm going to bring to bear some of that work today, as well as some previous work that I've done on anger and relationships. It's a talk on humor, and as my friend Sean said, it had better be funny. So I hope it'll be somewhat funny as we go through. What I'm interested in is exactly a phenomenon like this, where you've got anger at or in response to some kind of amused reaction. Or maybe it's more like this. I think this may be more accurate. You're trying to stay angry, and there's someone who's able to shake you out of that anger to get you to laugh your way out of that anger. And it's this kind of phenomenon that I'm most interested, I think, and I'm going to pursue that today. I'm going to start with a quote that's going to be famous, that many of you will recognize. It's from a famous philosopher named Peter Strawson. And in this famous article that he wrote called Freedom and Resentment, he was interested in two kinds of stances that we can take towards one another. On the one hand, there's a participant stance where we're emotionally vulnerable to one another. And on the other hand, there's a more objective stance where we treat each other more like objects to be moved around in various ways. I'll say more about the difference between those two stances as we go. But first, I want to just start with a really interesting quotation from Freedom and Resentment. If your attitude towards someone is wholly objective, right, then though you may fight him, you cannot quarrel with him. And though you may talk to him, even negotiate with him, you cannot reason with him. You can at most pretend to quarrel or to reason with him. Okay, I think this is deeply insightful. It's quite plausible and compelling for me. And I want to put it side by side with another quote from, it's a far less famous quote. It's from the leading philosopher of humor, John Morial, which I think goes really nicely with the original quote from Strawson. When two people are quarreling, one of the first things they stop doing together is laughing. They refuse to laugh at each other's attempts at humor. As soon as they begin to laugh once more, we know that the end of the quarrel is at hand. This also feels deeply insightful to me, quite plausible and compelling. But what it does then is raise some interesting and puzzling questions, and these are the ones I want to pursue today. So on the one hand, quarrels and amusement of a certain sort, I'll explain what, they both require that we stand in this emotionally vulnerable and engaged stance relative to one another. But they are mutually exclusive. It seems like to be angry at someone in a certain sort of way when you're quarreling, that's incompatible with our starting to be amused, and vice versa. If we're amused with one another, it's hard to have a good quarrel. So I'm interested in the relation between these two. Why are they mutually exclusive, and how exactly? So we're going to start off with quarrels. So I'll say just a little bit more about the objective versus participant stance. The participant stance is represented by the photos on the right. These are the ones that we're all in with each other as a kind of default right now. We're emotionally vulnerable, we're emotionally engaged in various kinds of ways. Not that we're feeling anything, but we're vulnerable to it. And we might find certain things about one another that would get us to move away from this more participant stance to a more objective stance. The objective stance is one in which Strawson says we're viewing our subjects as basically objects to be managed, handled, cured, or trained, or perhaps merely to be avoided. And so that's the sort of thing that you see with generals thinking about strategy with regard to the troops. So you can imagine that Eisenhower, before D-Day, if he was in the participant stance with all the soldiers that he knew full well were going to die, it would have been emotionally overwhelming. So he has to view them instead as sort of objects, as pawns to be moved around. Same thing with prison wardens. They may say, let's try to figure out how best to design the prison so as to reduce conflict. And so they're thinking of the various prisoners as just kind of objects to be moved around in various kinds of ways. So think of the participant stance, we're emotionally vulnerable to one another, and the objective stance is one in which we're viewing one another more or less as objects. Now, what then are quarrels? Here's a stab at it, and you let me know whether or not it's any good. It's a type of disagreement, but it's not any old type of disagreement. You and I, my partner, say, we want to figure out where to go to dinner, and I say, here's a reason we should maybe go to this place over here. They have great cocktails, and you say, yeah, but I like the salmon dish so much at this other place. We're disagreeing about where to go, but it's not a quarrel until it rises to a certain sharp-edged point that we're all familiar with. And I think the sharp edge here is a kind of anger. So what Strawson says about anger, what he calls resentment, indignation, these are just terms that depend on your point of view relative to the person who injures you. But these kinds of responses are responses to what we take to be of very great importance, he says, namely the attitudes and intentions towards us of other human beings, of how much we actually mind, how much it matters to us, whether the actions of other people, and particularly of some other people, reflect attitudes towards us of goodwill, affection, or esteem on the one hand, or contempt, indifference, or malevolence on the other. These are the kinds of attitudes that people might have towards us that fall under this general rubric of what's known as quality of will. So anger is a response to poor quality of will. And that's a response to an injury or some attitude that someone has that reflects a kind of malevolence or indifference or maybe contempt. And so when I am disagreeing with you, and it turns out that it looks like the reasons you're taking seriously aren't the reasons that I take seriously, and you're failing to take seriously something about me and my reasons and my ends, anger is a kind of appropriate response. So when our disagreement rises to that level of sharp-edged anger, I think that's when we're in a quarrel. Now, what's the point of anger? What is it aiming at? Many philosophers have followed Aristotle's lead, and he writes about this in the Rhetoric. He says it's an impulse accompanied by pain to a conspicuous revenge for a conspicuous slight directed without justification towards what concerns oneself or towards what concerns one's friends. I want to emphasize the revenge part. I think the slight part is correct, that anger appropriately responds to a certain kind of slight, where we can think of that as a disrespect, and that may be a result of malevolence or negligence, contempt, and so forth. But I think he's wrong about the revenge bit. So lots of people, especially philosophers, have thought that what anger aims at is a kind of retaliation or revenge. I don't think that's quite right. I think that's a subset of the kinds of things that anger aims at more generally, which is a confrontation, kind of communication. Anger wants to be heard to the person who is the trigger of the anger. Now, I think retaliation is, as I said, it's a very dramatic form of communicating, of confronting someone. But I think there are plenty of other cases in which anger moves us to merely confront without retaliation. So you come home, my partner, yet again, let's see, late and drunk, and I just shakingly shut the door in your face. Now, that's a motivation out of anger, which aims at communication of something, but not retaliation. Let's see. I might be out of batteries. Okay. You write an angry letter to your senator. It's not retaliatory. I'm not going to be ignored, Dan. You express it in a very angry tone of voice. Now, there is retaliation that occurs later in this movie, if you haven't seen it, Fatal Attraction. There's some bunnies involved and some hot water. But at this point, it's simply confronting with anger. I want it to be communicated. Now, it can't be the case that anger just wants to communicate itself. It's got to be wanting to communicate something. And I think it's beautifully brought out in this clip that I'm about to show you from the wonderful movie Midnight Cowboy. I realize I'm referencing fairly old movies. I'm fairly old. But in it, Dustin Hoffman plays this character, Ratso Rizzo, who's a hustler on the streets of New York, and there's a newbie in town, played by John Voight. I think his name is Joe Buck. And so he's walking him around the city, and he's explaining to him how to hustle people. And there's a famous scene that occurs that was totally improvised. And you'll see what it is and what happens.
When these gals are on a fire, most of them are old and dignified. Social registered types, you know what I mean? They can't be trotting down in Times Square to pick up the merchandise. They gotta have some kind of,
I'm walking here! I'm walking here! Up here, you son of a bitch! You don't talk me that way! Get out of here! Don't worry about that. Actually, that ain't a bad way to pick up insurance, you know.
All right, so again, famously improvised scene. They're shooting on the streets of New York, and a cab turns the corner unexpectedly, and Dustin Hoffman somehow maintains his character and slams on the hood and says, I'm walking here, I'm walking here. Now, what's going on there? He's clearly angry, but he's not retaliating. He's not aiming at revenge. What is he trying to do? He's trying to demand something of the cabbie, namely that he acknowledge him. I'm walking here. So he's trying to point out that there's an interest of mine that you failed to take sufficiently seriously. I think that's what's going on more generally with anger. Yes, retaliation is a very dramatic form of communicating that demand, but I think it can be done in other sorts of ways, and that's what anger actually seeks. So it's to communicate a demand for acknowledgement. Now, it's in part just to acknowledge my existence and that I have ends and projects and so forth, but also when you've wronged me, and especially we see this in close interpersonal relationships, when you've wronged me and I'm angry at you, I'm demanding that you acknowledge how you made me feel when you wronged me. Now, in order to do that, you've got to take up my perspective. You've got to think about things from my point of view with my particular ends and values. And when you hurt me, or when you wronged me, you hurt me. And it caused a kind of pain. So if you genuinely acknowledge what it felt like to be me when you wronged me, you yourself are going to feel some pain. Well, just call that remorse. I think that's what remorse is. So the demand that's expressed or communicated by anger, it's successfully met when you've got this simpatico, painful experience. Okay? So how does this pertain to quarrels? Well, vulnerability to anger, I think, is what's unique to, and it's presupposed by quarrels, and it's triggered by a kind of ill will in reasons exchanges. So here we are disagreeing. I'm going to go here, you want to go there, or maybe I think we should do this with the house, and you say, no, we should do something else with the house. And so we have disagreements over reasons that are taking place here. And when it rises to the level of a quarrel, there's a kind of anger that's involved, where the anger responds appropriately to what we think of as a slight, kind of disrespect, failure to take me sufficiently seriously. And so when it arises in that way, through my recognition or my perception that I think you're not treating the things that I care about as valuable or as sufficiently valuable, that I have various kinds of reasons that flow from my values, and I just don't think you're paying sufficient attention to them. You're being obstinate, truculent, maybe culpably negligent when it comes to recognizing the kinds of things that matter to me. Those are the things that aptly trigger a kind of anger that I think is distinctive of quarrels. So I think quarrels can only take place within this participant stance where we're emotionally vulnerable in certain ways to one another. And that means what's being demanded by anger is you take up my perspective, you feel what it was like to be me, and that's just a demand for empathy. So when I'm demanding acknowledgement from you, I'm demanding a kind of empathy from you. And so because this has to and only can take place within the participant stance, then the participant stance itself requires the capacity for a certain kind of empathy. All right? That's one thing that we can draw from this, and that view predicts certain things about people who have impairments in empathy or incapacities with regard to empathy, namely that you can't quarrel with them. And I think that's right. So I hope this is not the case for you, but I've had some psychopaths in my life, and you cannot quarrel with them. It's impossible to quarrel with a psychopath. There's been much more study done on narcissism. So, and I'll come back to psychopaths later, but all over online you find out people pleading, what do? I find myself in a relationship with a psychopath. How do I argue with a psychopath? And the answer that, I mean, not a psychopath, sorry, a narcissist. And the answer that psychologists give is don't. If you want to maintain your mental health, simply say, you're right, and get out of it. That's the only strategy that there is. And that's because they have several kinds of argument tactics. Note, I'm not saying these are quarreling tactics. They are argument tactics. They never admit fault. They're never wrong. Narcissists think they're the best one in the room. And so how could they be wrong? They deflect. You accuse them of things and they deflect, they put it back on you. They project, they gaslight, make you feel like you're going crazy. They play the victim, they devalue the other person, and I don't think these are strategies that are quarrels. Why not? Well, I think what these are doing is aiming at manipulation. They're aiming to win the argument. And so they are not engaged empathically with you. They don't acknowledge wrongdoing. They can't acknowledge what it was like for you when you made them, when they made you feel that way. And they're not vulnerable to being persuaded or being shown wrong. So what this suggests is that there's a crucial mutuality that's required for quarrels. That we are, in engaging in the quarrel, both also mutually vulnerable to its ending. And its ending in a certain sort of way. Not that someone just gives up, says, I'm out of here, I can't deal with this anymore. So we're not engaged in this kind of strategic manipulation with regard to one another. Maybe sometimes we creep in that direction, but most of the time when you're quarreling with a close friend or a partner or a lover, that you're not just strategically aiming to get the other side to concede. You're actually open to being open to a kind of mutual resolution. So narcissists, I think, can't, at least to the degree that they are empathically impaired, they can't be viewed from the participant stance because they're not emotionally vulnerable in the right sorts of ways. So they need to be viewed from the objective stance. You can't quarrel with them, just walk away. Get away as fast as you can. All right. This then suggests that there are a couple of ways of ending quarrels, where we're both in that mutual space, we're both emotionally vulnerable to one another. On the one hand, we can achieve it by a kind of mutual acknowledgement of relevant reasons, or the facts that count as reasons, or the relative weight of our reasons, or what's best for us to do, all things considered. Think of this as the reasons route, and this is a very familiar way of ending a quarrel. What often happens is that one partner says to the other, oh, I didn't realize how important that was to you. Sorry. That's a very natural way of ending a quarrel. I'm coming to the recognition that, oh, okay, this thing mattered to you a lot more than I thought it did. Or this thing that I thought was just some kind of random fact, you're really taking that seriously as a reason. So we come to that acknowledgement and we can resolve the quarrel through the reasons route. That's one way out. There's another way out that I'm going to spend the rest of my time on, and it's not resolution per se, it's dissolution. How might we dissolve the quarrel between us? Now, there are some ways you can do so that I'm not going to talk about. These are kind of adventitious events that occur in the midst of a quarrel. You and your partner are quarreling, the dog vomits on the rug. You got to stop and you got to clean up the vomit. Or the smoke alarm goes off, or your daughter calls and she's in distress, and you both just come together to immediately say, okay, set this aside, let's go help our daughter. Those are ways of dissolving the current conflict, the current quarrel. But it leaves the disagreement on the table, and it may be resumed after you've cleaned up the vomit or gone to help your daughter, etc. Okay? But it can dissolve the quarrel. What I'm interested in is a comic route out, and to investigate the relation between humor and amusement and quarreling. So that's what I want to investigate in the rest of the talk. Now, first things first, we have to get clear on the type of humor that I think can be quarrel ending. So it's not the case that when you and I are in the midst of a quarrel, I tell you a joke and we're going to get out of it, right? We're going back and forth. I can't believe you did that, blah, 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 blah. A priest, a rabbi, and a duck walk into a bar, and then you finish with the punchline. That's not the kind of humor that's quarrel ending. Instead, it's what I call wisecracks. So I just want to take some time to talk about the difference between the two. This is a rough and ready distinction. It should be fairly familiar. So jokes are the sorts of things that are canned, they're pre-written, whereas wisecracks, it's improvisational. Somebody comes up with the funny thing on the spot. Jokes are monological. It's just me it's me delivering a monologue to you. You sit back, ha ha ha. Whereas wisecracks are part of conversations that we have with one another. Jokes you see coming, you hear that setup. Priest, rabbi, duck, etc. Wisecracks you often don't. The best wisecrackers are the ones that can say something with a completely straight face and you say, yeah, that's very, hey, wait a second, you got me. Jokes are told, they're performed, it's one person again. Wisecracks are the things we make with each other. It's part of a kind of amusement party that we're having. We build on one another. Jokes are solo performances. Wisecracks are very interpersonal. So just a rough understanding of wisecracks. They're improvised, spontaneous wit between people. Includes leg pulling, pranks, mockery, teasing, banter, ball busting, impersonation, stereotyping, exaggerated anecdotes, callbacks to previous conversation, amusement parties, and so forth. Okay? So with that rough understanding of wisecracks, it should be clear why these are the sorts of things that we're engaged in the participant stance with one another. It's part of our interpersonal lives, but that's also the way in which the reason that wisecracks raise certain kinds of moral issues. I don't think jokes do, but wisecracks do. All right, so you might think we can't go on unless we understand what makes things funny. The answer is yes, we can go on without understanding what makes things funny because it's a notoriously vexed enterprise. Many of these properties have been pointed to as the one thing that makes all things funny, that are funny, funny, and is exclusive only to funny things. And the right answer is, yeah, sometimes, in some contexts, each of these things does contribute to making things funny, and there are more, but it's not any one of these singly, and no one can give an account, a good first-order account of what makes things funny, I think, except to say, sometimes it's this, sometimes it's that, sometimes it's this, sometimes it's that. So that's the best we're going to be able to do. But I think all we need to move forward is to agree that there are some things that are funny. Okay? I think that's safe enough. What I want to emphasize are the values of engaging in this kind of humor. And there are a lot, and they are completely underappreciated, I think. They're very thoroughgoing in our lives, these kinds of humorous exchanges. So first of all, it's fun. It brings people together. Amusement feels good. It's enjoyable to be amused. And so if you're amusing, I want to hang around you. And if I'm amusing, I want to hang around the people who are amused by my amusing remarks because it's enjoyable to make people laugh, etc. So it brings people together in really powerful ways. It invites sympathy. So some kinds of humor involve a certain kind of self-deprecation. I'm making fun of myself in certain ways, and you might have gone through the same things that I'm going through, so that invites your sympathy, your identification with me, brings us together. I'm going to say a lot about this later. It enables a certain kind of coping. So there's a kind of humor that if you can laugh at the difficulties that you're having, it better enables you to get over those difficulties. It reduces uncertainty of social distance. It increases cooperation. They found this in work environments, that the teams that are laughing together cooperate much more with one another, and they get a lot more things done, and they get them done in a better fashion. This is a really important point, that a certain kind of humor is a kind of blame, I think. What it does is reinforce or maintain various norms that we've got, both moral and non-moral. So what we do is mock each other sometimes for certain failures relative to some standards. And I think that kind of mockery serves to get people to toe the line pretty quickly. So Francis Hutcheson, out of the history of Western philosophers, is the only one who had a positive view about mockery and what he calls ridicule, and I'm with him. So he says, men have been laughed out of faults that a sermon could not accomplish. So if you're thinking of wagging your finger and yelling at somebody, that often has a kind of backfire effect. People resist that. But if you're laughing at them for some failure and other people are laughing along, by God, they're not going to make that mistake again. So it's a very effective form of maintaining social norms. And it also tests and alters relationships for the better. So think about the odd phrase, I don't know her well enough to tease her like that. You have to kind of know somebody. Well, you can actually reach out to a mere acquaintance with a kind of gentle tease, and if they respond in a certain way, you're suddenly over the hump a little bit towards friendship. So it has all of these incredibly valuable goods that are attached to it. Now, I'm not naive. I know that there are lots of ills, lots of disvalue that's attached to certain kinds of humor as well. But I want to emphasize the positives today. And so, to get them, you have to engage in the right sort of humor. There are these positive goods, but they only attach to certain kinds of humor. And so here, I want to appeal to the psychologists who have been doing for the last 25 years, starting with Rod Martin and colleagues, some really great work, I think, in thinking about humor relative to certain kinds of people. So there are 4 general categories that they're calling humor styles here. And these are just the kinds of styles of humor that people are inclined towards, both to be amused by and to engage in most-ish. And so the first 2 are correlated positively with well-being, and the last 2 are correlated negatively with well-being for what will be obvious reasons. So the first kind of humor is affiliative, and it's just found in the back and forth, mutual bantering and teasing, ball busting and so forth that we engage in with one another all the time. That's the kind of thing that serves the bonding function. It's obvious why that's correlated positively with well-being. You're fun to be around, right? Funny people are fun to be around. You want to be around them. Self-enhancing humor, it's poorly labeled, but it has to do with those who are most inclined towards humor styles, or a humor style that helps them cope with the various difficulties of life. So these are people who are able to make light of a very difficult situation. So it enhances the self. It enables the self to cope and survive. Obviously correlated positively with well-being if you can do that. The last 2, self-defeating humor is a kind of humor in which you offer yourself up as the butt of the joke. You reveal your flaws in a way that you're inviting people to make fun of you for those flaws. You're not doing it yourself. That's self-enhancing. You're inviting other people to make fun of you. It's obvious why that's correlated negatively with well-being. It hurts to be a punching bag, and that's what you're offering yourself up as. And the final humor style is aggressive, and it's exactly what you think it is. It's a kind of mean sarcasm, cruel jokes and pranks, ridicule, put-downs, these kinds of things. Now, so psychologists who put together the humor styles categories, they wanted to do so in order to see how various personalities, what kinds of humor styles they were inclined towards. And one of the very first groups that they wanted to explore were the dark triad. So the dark triad consists of 3 different personality disorders or types. You've got psychopaths, you've got narcissists, and you've got Machiavellians. And Machiavellians are people who like to pull people's puppet strings to try to create conflict between them for their own amusement, for their own enjoyment. Okay? Now, they are studied together because this kind of personality disorder predicts manipulative action, callous action. They're emotionally callous. Their humor style is exactly what you think it is. It's aggressive. They like to play mean tricks on people, engage in sarcasm, put down, ridicule, and so forth, almost exclusively. And these 3, they score off the charts on Schadenfreude. So enjoying the downfall of others, no matter whether or not they are mighty or not. They like to see people fail, get hurt, and go through distressing things. Okay? I think they have bad senses of humor. And here's why. They see reasons for amusement that don't exist. And they see this, so take a case in which you and I are walking along and I trip and stumble and scrape my knee or something, and I get up and I don't know what I tripped over. I'm looking back. You think that's amusing maybe. And so there's been a little failure that occurred, and we find that funny. It's what Hobbes was thinking of as superiority humor. So we find things funny when it reveals, hey, I'm superior to you in some way. Now, that's a property, superiority, and attached to a kind of failure. Now scale it up. Now when I trip and fall, I hit my head on the sidewalk, it cracks open, there's blood spraying everywhere. I apologize for the graphic image, but you've got those same 2 original properties, right? Superiority and a failure of some kind. And members of the dark triad think, well, if it was funny in this case, it's funny in this case. And what I think is, and I hope you share the intuition here, that a certain level of blood spurting eliminates the humor from these kinds of things. So, but they continue to think there are reasons for amusement in those grand cases of failure, pain, and so forth. They also don't see reasons for amusement that do exist, and this is what really matters here. They fail to see reasons in favor of affiliative humor, of finding affiliative humor funny. So the back and forth bantering and teasing, why? Why don't they? Well, it's because it requires mutuality. We have to be mutually vulnerable to being teased in this sort of back and forth fun way, and why would I, let's say as a narcissist, want to let you put me down? For the same reason, they are not interested or they see no reasons for funny in self-enhancing humor, which has to do with self-deprecation, weirdly. So if I'm making fun of myself, I think that's funny sometimes. They think, why would I ever make fun of myself? Right? So I think both of these contribute to their having a bad sense of humor. And what's the source? Guess what? Empathic impairments. So the members of the dark triad all have empathic impairments. Now, we already know that empathic impairments or incapacities, they leave you in the objective stance. You can't be in the participant stance. But what we've only explored is whether or not that can put you into a state of quarreling. We say no. But that also leaves you out of the positive benefits of affiliative humor and self-enhancing humor. So you lose out on these positive goodies because of the empathic impairments. Go back to the narcissist argument tactics that I talked about. I talked about these, but one that shows up online all of the time is when you are arguing with a narcissist, what they appeal most to is a certain kind of humor, particularly aggressive humor. It's sarcasm. It's this kind of mincing mockery. So think of it as you say, well, I don't think we should do that. And they say, well, I don't think you should do that. So they think that kind of mincing mockery is funny. And so that's the kind of strategy that they use. So here we are. Both quarreling and the valuable kinds of wisecracking, affiliative and self-enhancing, they require the same capacity to take up the participant stance, namely empathy. So if you're impaired in empathy, you're going to be impaired for the participant stance. You're going to be impaired for quarrels and cracks. All right? Empathy is necessary. Certain kind of robust perspective taking, in particular, taking up other people's perspectives in a way that generates a kind of simpatico-emotional response on your part. So think of it as a kind of emotional empathy that's necessary. Both require empathy. Why are they mutually exclusive? If I'm ready to be empathic with you, why can't I both be angry and amused by the very same thing? That's what I'm going to explore in the rest of the time. So let's ask first about what kind of humor can end quarrels in some way or another. Now we know what kind doesn't. Neither self-defeating nor aggressive humor. It actually increases the temperature in arguments. So it's interesting. I mean, it's obvious why aggressive humor does that. If you're engaged in mincing mockery or sarcasm or put-downs, that's just going to make your partner angrier. Self-defeating humor is interesting because what I'm doing is offering my faults up for display for you to make fun of. And it turns out in arguments, if I offer my faults up, my additional faults up for consideration, you have more reasons to be angry at me. So it increases the anger level. So these kinds of humor styles don't work. We know what does, though, and there's been very little work on this, but what has been quite illustrative. This is from a meta-study. Here we find that affiliative humor was systematically related to positive observer-rated partner responses, so more laughter, less anger, greater satisfaction with conflict resolution. Individuals who used it were also more satisfied with conflict resolution themselves. So affiliative humor works. That's just the back and forth banter, mutual vulnerability to amusement that we're all familiar with. The problem is finding examples. So there are plenty of examples on TikTok that are about how to end a fight, how to end a quarrel, how to end an argument with your partner. Problem is, and they're supposedly funny ways. The problem is they're not that funny, or at least they're not that funny to outsiders looking in. And I think the reason for that is that the kind of affiliative humor that ends quarrels within close relationships is so specific to those relationships, requires a kind of information that you only get from having a shared background and all these experiences that you've gone through that you can point to and say, ah ha ha ha, ha. And so you both get it and you can move on. So people outside the relationship have a hard time sussing out why it's so funny. But it is, and it's effective in ending quarrels. I'm interested in what couldn't be studied. And the psychologists doing this work say explicitly we can't study it, and it's self-enhancing humor. Why is that? Well, affiliative humor is easy to observe in the lab. It's two people laughing with one another and making these quips and these kind of teases and faux insults and so forth. All right? It's very easy to observe. What's definitive of self-enhancing humor is your intention or motive. What are you doing here? I see like this difficulty presented to me, and I want to engage in humor in order to help me deal with it. So you have to be able to suss out motivations and intentions in order to study self-enhancing humor, and psychologists are very afraid of that sort of thing. They want to look at the behavior, the easily measurable. Nothing against psychologists at all, but it's just very hard to study. We're philosophers. We don't have this difficulty. So we can look at what the nature of self-enhancing humor is and to see if it has some features that would lend themselves well to quarrel-ending amusement. So that's what I want to do. I want to look at, what is it? Is it interpersonal? And how might it contribute to ending quarrels as well? So start with what it is. It's a way of responding with humor to life's curveballs. I've already said this. There are two general types, I think. The first is self-deprecation. I've already talked about this. It's what's exemplified when Jon Stewart says, you can't read it, I'm 145 pounds of asthma. It's what is exemplified when Jennifer Lawrence accepted the Oscar. As she was going up the steps, she tripped and fell and then got up. She says, you guys are just, and they gave her a standing ovation, you guys are just standing up because you feel bad that I fell and that's really embarrassing, but thank you. And it's kind of a very ingratiating, amusing kind of moment. Self-deprecation, that's one kind of self-enhancing humor. I am interested in what follows in a different kind of self-enhancing humor, which I think is absurdist humor. And it's beautifully represented in the final scene of Monty Python's Life of Brian. If you haven't seen it, I won't be insulted if you go out and watch it right now. Brian has been mistaken for the Messiah all along. At the end of the movie, he's crucified, and he's crucified with a bunch of other thieves and rascals. And this very chipper thief behind him, played by Eric Idle, starts singing, don't be glum, always look on the bright side of life. So this represents both absurdist humor and a comment on the kind of absurdist humor that I'm going to press for. And to do so, I'm going to start with a very famous article by Thomas Nagel, 1970, called The Absurd. And there he talks about two kinds of absurdity. Not two kinds, two locations. The absurdity in life, which is just a conspicuous discrepancy between pretension or aspiration and reality. So one example is a legislator who gets up before the Congress and makes this impassioned speech in favor of some legislation that it turns out has already passed. And the other example he gives is, as you're being knighted, your pants fall down. Now that's kind of absurdity in life, but there's a distinctive kind of absurdity that we can perceive because of a distinctive kind of capacity that we humans have. And that's to step back a bit and reflect on the lives that we're living. So this, he says, arises when we perceive an inflated pretension or aspiration which is inseparable from the continuation of human life and which makes its absurdity inescapable, short of escape from life itself. Okay. Here, too, there are two perspectives, but don't mistake them for overlapping with the participant and the objective stance. The first is what he calls the engaged perspective, and it's the perspective we're all in most of the time. We're in it now. There are certain kinds of values that we've got, projects and ends. These give us reasons for action. They give us reasons to get out of bed in the morning. It's what we're pursuing throughout most of our day. That these are things that matter. And these things that matter, I want to pursue. And I have a good reason to pursue. But, again, distinctive to we humans, we have the ability to step back from the engaged perspective, so call it the step back move, and we can take a much more reflective perspective. We can see from the perspective of the universe, or the God's eye view, or maybe the view from nowhere. we step back and we see this eternity of time. And we see these little creatures down there pursuing these little values and ends that they've got. And boy, from here, they sure look like ants dragging a grain of sand up the anthill, putting it in the hole, and then the anthill is, of course, blown away by the winds of time, destroyed, never to be seen again. You can think here of Ozymandias, those of you who are familiar with that poem, who had said, "Look upon my works." How's it go? And be amazed. What is it? Ye mighty, that's right, and be amazed. And it turns out that it's just ruins. There's nothing left. So there are two aspects of this reflective perspective I think we can take. One is we see these lives of such striving earnestness that in the grand scheme of things probably means nothing. That's one kind of thing. The other thing is I see that I've got these particular values and ends that I'm pursuing, but from here I can see this is coming from a very specific location in space and time and culture. And that there are these other people over here are pursuing very different projects and ends. And I realize the projects and values and ends that I've got, they came from very specific location, very specific culture, having been born to the specific parents I had, indoctrinated and educated in the ways that I would. But if I'd been born over here and had these kinds of parents and lived in this particular culture and society, I would have had very different values and ends. That is to say, what I recognize is how contingent all of this is, how arbitrary maybe it is. And what I come to see is, wow, maybe all this stuff that I think really matters doesn't at all. Now, this isn't nihilism, it's just recognizing the possibility of nihilism. And that shakes us to our core. What we recognize is that there's this vast discrepancy between our inflated pretensions of worth, all of this earnest striving for things that we think really, really matter, and the possibility that it's all pointless. Even the rational methods that we've got for criticizing and evaluating our ends and so forth, those too are a product of place and time. So we may not even have the right means to evaluate whether or not what we're pursuing is rational or worth pursuing. All right. So we have to live, though. We have to continue living. And we can only live by ignoring our doubts. But once you've been exposed through the step-back move, those doubts remain at the back of your mind. So, let's look at this. He says, in just a quick aside, this realization may be both sobering and comical. And of course, I'm interested in the comedy. So how to find it? It depends on where you focus your attention. On the one hand, if you focus on the possibility that everything you're pursuing may not matter, that's the perspective from which the saliva dries up. And you think, oh my God, I might be pursuing this entire life which ultimately has no meaning at all. That is sobering. So if you're just focusing on the possibility of nihilism, that's the sobering part, I think. If you can focus instead on the disparity between the lofty ideals, all of this earnest striving, and the fact that none of it may matter, right there is the comedy. That's where you find the comedy, and that's in the absurdity. So a friend of mine told me a story about a political philosopher who's very, very famous and used to stand and deliver these perfectly written and argued lectures. You probably know exactly who I'm talking about. And there's like an hour long, never moved, didn't have a lectern, had no notes, just stood and delivered this beautifully articulated argument. And my friend saw him do this one time, giving an argument about dignity. And the entire time, his fly was down. So imagine him afterwards seeing a film of this. What's the reaction going to be? It's a humiliation, a kind of shame, embarrassment. What's he doing? He's focusing on the lack of dignity here. But if he, like the audience, there was a he, yeah. If he, like the audience, could instead focus on the disparity between a high-minded talk on the nature of human dignity presented in the most undignified way, there's the comedy. Okay? So that's how you find it. Now, I've been talking about a grand conception here. This is stepping back to the point of view of the universe and seeing that maybe nothing matters. We can rarely do that. It's very difficult to do, very difficult to sustain. I think what we do is a much more local version, though, sometimes, where what we're doing is stepping back from some values while holding others fixed. And we can do the same thing, I think. We can still notice the disparity between our pretensions with respect to those values and the reality that they may not have any grounding, and we can see the comedy there even though we're holding on to some values. We're doing it from a value-laden kind of perspective. So I think we can do this. The question is, why? Why should we do it? And the answer comes from first responders. So, doctors and nurses in the ER, detectives going to a murder scene, firefighters, they are famous for having very dark senses of humor. That while they're in the throes of being presented with what would ordinarily be these unbelievably emotionally distressing scenes, grisliness, torture and death, making fun of it, making light of it, cracking wise about it in the face of it. Now, why? This has been very well studied. Humor and first responders. There's a lot of research on this. And it has all these incredible benefits. They're coping benefits. It enables them to cope with what they're being presented with, which is, for the rest of us, ridiculously emotionally distressing. I'm assuming you're not a first responder. If you are, maybe this resonates. So it's got all of these incredible coping benefits. So, okay, there's value to it. How do they do it? What they're doing is distracting and detaching. So, turns out that humor that focuses attention on the absurdity, both in life and of life, it dampens emotional distress. It does so by distracting away from the emotionally distressing features to other properties, here the disparity between pretensions and reality. And it has this very surprising, interesting benefit. It enables the first responders to focus more clearly on the cognitive tasks at hand. It does not distract from the cognitive focus that they need to help the people that they're treating. So it dampens the emotional stress that most of the rest of us would feel overwhelmed by, and so enables a sharpened focus on the things that matter in this case. If I'm wheeled into the ER, spraying blood again, I want the doctors and nurses to be cracking wise, because I know then, hopefully, they'll be genuinely focused on the task at hand. Now, a couple final remarks. Most of the emotions we've got appraise things that are taken to matter. Emotions are typically, they're appraisals of various properties. So something like fear, it appraises threats. It appraises the charging bear as a threat, as dangerous to me. And tracking threats and dangers really matters to me. That's what enables us to survive, okay? Something like pride. It appraises some results as splendid with which I'm closely associated. And so I feel pride at the kinds of things that matter. If I'm a success in certain ways, I'm proud about that, and the success matters. Disgust appraises infectious things, typically, and it matters to us that we can track infections for obvious reasons so we can avoid them. Something like anger appraises slights, which is a kind of disrespect. And as Strawson points out, these are things that are of very great importance to us. What's fascinating is that amusement often appraises things as not mattering. So you're walking with a friend and they trip and fall, but everything's good. Well, it's funny. It's superiority in the not mattering way. That it turns out that this was just a kind of trivial fall, nothing really hung on it, you weren't hurt. Whereas that's different in the case in which I've fallen and my head splits open, etc. And in particular, absurdist humor, I think, treats things as not mattering. And so is amusing. So another Monty Python sketch, The Ministry of Silly Walks. And what's hilarious about that sketch, I think, is that the minister of Silly Walks treats Silly Walks as the most serious thing in the world. He's looking to fund various projects of silliness. And so we see this disparity between the seriousness with which he's taking these things and how silly it all is. Right? So this kind of amusement views things as not mattering in a way that can emotionally, or dampen the emotional distress you might feel, and enable you to focus on the cognitive task at hand. So how do we get there? In the Civil War, lots of soldiers lost arms and legs, and they were very depressed. And doctors treating them found that if they gave them glasses with rose-colored tints in them, it actually lifted their moods, thus the phrase. And since then, scientists have found that a variety of different kinds of tints that people wear can alter their moods in really interesting and predictable ways. What I'm going to suggest, oddly, is that we can get to the same spot as the first responders in cases in which we need this kind of coping benefit. We take off our empathic distress glasses and instead put on, for a little while anyway, our psychopath glasses. And, the deeper point, sometimes empathy demands it. All right? So I want you to think about a recent, or not a recent, just any kind of distressing experience that you might have had, involving various kinds of pains or injuries, and you tell this to a close friend. And the way in which you tell this initially, usually, to the close friend is just by laying out the facts of the matter. But there's a different way you can tell the tale, and it's a way in which you are exaggerating certain events. So just as an example, about 10 years ago, I was walking down the driveway in my house in Toledo, Ohio, or maybe this is 15 years ago, and I was going to pick up the morning paper, and there was black ice there. I didn't recognize it was there, and I slipped on it. I know you're not familiar with what that is out here. But I slipped on the black ice. I fell back on my back. I broke 3 ribs. I was in terrible pain for about 6 months. It was awful. There was all sorts of activities I was restricted from doing. The doctor didn't even, we had to take multiple x-rays to find out, oh my God, there's actually 3 broken ribs here. Awful, right? Now, I can also tell that tale in the following sorts of ways. So here I am walking down. I've got this under control. I know it's winter, I'm not scared of winter. Turns out I slip on this ice, and as I'm going back like this, everything goes in slow motion. And I hear, as I'm falling to the ground, Tom Petty singing, "Free Fallin'." And I look at that and I say, man alive, this is happening to somebody else. This would be hilarious. I hit the ground, the shrubbery. So anyway, you can tell that story in a very exaggerated way. Now what are you doing? You're presenting yourself, when you do so, as a kind of cartoon character. And you are heightening the disparity here between pretensions and reality. Here I was thinking I could walk, no problem, and I'm slipping and falling, etc. So I've got these inflated pretensions, lowly reality crept in, and therein lies the funny. What I'm doing when I start to tell you that story in the comically exaggerated way is that I'm inviting you to do the same. I'm inviting empathy. I'm inviting you to see my view of the distressing events in the way that I'm now seeing them, namely as funny. And we can go back and forth. This is actually a capacity we have to put on the empathic distress glasses, put on the psychopath glasses. There's a great story told by my colleague John Doris. He and a friend were trying to move a pool table that they had from one room to the other. And as they were doing so, the legs snapped off, the pool table smashed to the ground, it ruined the floor, it ruined the pool table, and in the dust and debris that were circling around them, they say, what can you do but laugh? He said they collapsed in laughter. He has a great term for this. He calls it tragilarious. This is the kind of reaction that we're seeking in these kinds of cases. What else can you do but laugh? And here's where we've got a really interesting connection, I think, with morality. Sometimes true empathy requires some emotional disengagement. That when I tell you that tale of woe in the comically exaggerated way, for you to fail to laugh along with me is a kind of moral failure. This is the big provocative claim. That there are those who refuse to go there with you. Right? They say, oh, no, you poor thing. How could you laugh about a thing like that? That's not funny at all. Well, yeah, it is. And if I'm genuinely inviting you, now, I agree there are cases in which some people will cover up with humor things that are truly bad, but cases in which I'm genuinely inviting you to empathize along with me, empathy requires reduction of emotional distress, sometimes. Emotional disengagement. I've had to practice what I preach. This is an artist rendition of my prostate. About 4 years ago, I was diagnosed with a very aggressive form of prostate cancer. And I had to get a prostatectomy. I had to get my prostate removed. And when I told some close friends about my diagnosis, I could, for a little while, stand a wee bit of sympathy, but what I really craved were wisecracks. And given the crowd around me, I got them. So, says one, leave it to you to get the weakest, most treatable cancer there is. Come on out for a drink, says another. You're not dead yet. This is my favorite. That is one radical strategy to get a break from your administrative duties. Now, these are not just assholes. They are my dearest asshole friends. And my gratitude for their wisecracking in the face of my diagnosis, my gratitude was very large and significant, just like my cancer-riddled prostate. All right, let's talk about what we've done here. You can't, I think, simultaneously be angered and positive amusement by the same person in response to the same events. Anger is a function of the very great importance we attach to the attitudes and intentions towards us of other human beings. So anger demands empathic emotional distress. That's what it wants. And quarrels are over things that we take to matter. So how can we dissolve them via this kind of comic absurdity? I have an example for you. And if only the participants in this quarrel had recognized how hilarious was a remark that one of them made, they could have both come out of it. But of course, it's a movie, and we weren't meant to come out of it, and it's an Albert Brooks' great movie, Modern Romance, in which he and his girlfriend have broken up and gotten back together so many times they've lost count. And so this is some of the dialogue, but I just want to focus on the last bit. He says, love has nothing to do with it. Yes, I love you. I mean, that makes it very confusing, but I just don't. You've heard of a no-win situation, haven't you? She says, no. No? Really? No? You've never heard of one? Vietnam? This? That right there is a beautiful example of absurd humor that if someone could make in the midst of a quarrel, might be the kind of thing that would dissolve the quarrel. Now, what in fact does it dissolve? All right, that's what I'll conclude with. What you're doing is establishing a kind of recognition, trying to share your own recognition that the stuff we're quarreling about may not matter all that much in the grand scheme of things. This is that local version, right, where you hold on to some values, step back from others. Now, what it's doing is distracting emotionally but not cognitively. So I think this is a real payoff. The disagreement is not eliminated by this kind of absurdist humor taking place within quarrels. Instead, what's dissolved is the sharp edge of the disagreement. Remember, it's anger that makes a disagreement a quarrel. So it dissolves the quarrel, but it doesn't eliminate the disagreement. But now what does it do? Remember what it does for the first responders. Detaching and distracting gets rid of the emotional distress part, but does not budge whatsoever the cognitive focus part. And so it enables you to focus on the things that in fact matter. Each other, for example. And that enables a productive focus on the reasons resolution way out of quarrels. Now, successful quarrel-ending humor is very, very tricky because what you're doing, and this is the part it'd be interesting to talk about because I'm not sure how stable this is, but what you'd be doing is abstracting away, you're distracting from the things that we're fighting over, which typically are kinds of values, things that matter to me. And we're saying that this thing that we're disagreeing over, that we're quarreling over, it really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But by God, you still matter. Now, that's, again, not something I'm sure is stable. If we can reflect on some, why not go all the way, right? But that's the stance I think we want to try to get to. The thing we're fighting over doesn't matter, but you still do. That's the tricky bit. All right, thanks a lot. Available for pre-order now.
Thanks, Dave. We're going to move now to open questions. online, you should be able to add your questions to the chat, so we'll be able to bring that into our discussion. And I'll start with anybody who wants to get us started off.
I really enjoyed the talk. I'm wondering if you can just help me think through cases where someone invites other people to laugh about something that was maybe tragic or traumatic, but then it lands really poorly and everyone's just kind of horrified.
Yeah.
I feel like this is a thing that people will talk about, with some regularity online in various places about I realized this thing that happened in my past was actually traumatic because I made a joke about it and it went over poorly at the party. How do you think about these sorts of cases in terms of the view that there's something inappropriate about not joining someone in the search for humor?
So I think there are two aspects to this case. So the thought is that what are kinds of cases in which somebody's telling the comically exaggerated tale of woe and other people are resisting going along, and it lands badly. And I think it can land badly in a couple of different ways. And I said at the end that this is very tricky. It's not just tricky in terms of your attitude towards the values and so forth. It's also tricky in terms of it's hard to be funny. So some people have a very difficult time telling the exaggerated tale of woe in a funny way. That's one way in which it might not land. But there's another more powerful and important way in which it might not land, and that's to, as I just barely suggested in the talk, that it could be that somebody's telling a tale of woe, something very, very serious and horrible that happened to them. But they're trying to do so in a comically exaggerated way, and it's not clear to you that they've fully realized the woeful part here in a way that they might need to come to grips with. So somebody who's trying to make light of a sexual assault, for example, would be a case, and in which there you want to say, whoa, hold on, let's hold on. I think something very serious happened to you. You may not understand fully what went on here, and I think it's important that you might want to work your way through that. What this does is reveal that there are all sorts of barriers to the successful execution of this kind of thing, and a lot of it's epistemic, that there are things we need to know about the other person. We need to know when they're seriously joking and when they're joking seriously. And so it's best probably in relationships that aren't that close not to engage in this kind of stuff. It can be very dangerous. But I'm thinking here of these close relationships, close friendships and partnerships in which you do know a lot about the other person and you do know what their tendencies are and whether or not this could actually be valuable for them in the way. That's the other thing is there's values to coping humor, but you might not get those values if you're doing so kind of disingenuously. And so when we can come to counsel people in this sort of way or realize that this is what's going on, then we might want to resist that kind of humor. So I don't want to say that absurdist humor, it's always the way out. Go home and practice your absurdism. It's instead that there's sometimes, in some relationships, in some ways, this can work. And it works in a really interesting and effective way that reveals, I think, important things about our relationships to one another. So all sorts of barriers need to be dealt with and crossed before you can successfully engage. I hope that addresses the question. Thanks.
Matthew. Yeah, thank you very much. That's fascinating. I've got a question that kind of follows on from Jake's. I was struck that you phrased it on this slide here. You said that one of the purposes of distracting from the emotional distress is to enable, as you put it, more productive focus on reasons resolution. But it strikes me that there's some other sort of non-reasons-based ways of resolving conflicts that are much more just based on kind of expression of emotion. Sometimes people will feel like the quarrel has come to its natural end where they had the opportunity to express their emotions.
Good, I see, yeah.
That's the quarrel, maybe in particular if they're quarreling with their partner. And if that's one way of resolving a quarrel, then I wonder, how do we balance the distraction from emotional distress against that potential way out of the quarrel? Because it seems like making these jokes run the risk of emotional invalidation if you're distracted from emotional distress. So if that is one way out of the quarrel, do these sort of jokes that you have in wisecracks that you have in mind still play an important role in that way out? Or?
That's really nice. I like that. So you think about the value simply of emotional expression I have an example in one paper where they talk about my wife comes home from work, her boss has been mistreating her, and she's so angry and inviting me to get angry right alongside her. And I say, you know, I'm so angry. This is what you ought to be doing. You didn't need to call HR. You need to do X, Y, and Z. And she yells back at me, don't. I know what to do. I just want you to understand what it was that I went through. And I think those are absolutely legitimate demands. So it's just an invitation for pure empathy in that case. But then it's just a matter of knowing what you need to know about your partner and whether or not this is the time then where you think kind of absurdist kind of humor would help, or maybe it wouldn't. Maybe there's a person who really needs to steam for a while and then be able to get through things. Now that's a case in which she's angry at somebody else, but I think the same thing could be true of me. I mean, there are a variety of ways of distracting each other, and some of them might be legitimate, some of them won't be in particular kinds of relationships. I know I can play a certain song and my wife who's in a bad mood will dissipate. But also Buddhists talk about this. They talk about ways in which you can reflect on yourself and what you are and what the other person is entirely through a reasons route and say, look, I'm just a sack of meat. You're just a sack of meat. Why is this sack of meat angry at that sack of meat? Doesn't make any sense, and so it kind of distracts away and it decreases that kind of distress. But I think you're exactly right. There are some cases in which, if you know your partner properly, just shut up and listen. So I don't want you wisecracking your way out of every quarrel. Thank you.
All right, got it. Paul and then
So I just have a slight question concerning so it seems like a central part of what you were saying is that, you know, it seems like humor, this kind of like, you know, amusement and anger, that there is some kind of incompatibility of having them both at the same time. But it seems to me like, you know, you can have, it seems like there's situations, at least in media and quite possibly in my own life, where you have this idea of like someone making a joke and someone saying, that's funny, I'm still mad at you, right? And so recognizing both the amusement of the humor but it doesn't eliminate the anger. So it seems like there's at least, or so maybe there's a more particular sense of amusement, like a very particular sense of amusement. Yeah. And a very particular sense of the anger involved, which is the particular thing, but it just wasn't necessarily clear offhand if the general claim that the amusement and the anger couldn't coincide in certain ways.
No, that's good. So I am thinking of a specific types of humor here. But just to go back to the previous question, the attempt to make some kind of crack can be responded to with don't. I want to be angry about this for a while. I know what you're trying to do. Stop it, right? And I think that's a legitimate demand that should be heard. But what I'm interested in part is that you could just tell a psychological story and say, this kind of anger is incompatible psychologically with this kind of amusement. And it's not joking, it's very specific kind of affiliative or self-enhancing. I think that those are the only ones that are relevant here. And I don't want to tell that just mere psychological incompatibility story. I want to say that, well, there's a reason for this, and that's because the anger that's partially constitutive of quarrels is, in fact, evaluating things as mattering. And the amusement that I think is constitutive of the participant stance in this positive way is evaluating things as not mattering. And so there's a kind of conceptual incompossibility between the two that I find really interesting. So the person who can say, yeah, that's funny, but I'm still angry at you. I don't think that this kind of anger renders your judgment capacities, it doesn't incapacitate your judgment abilities. There's a great documentary called Comedian where Jerry Seinfeld and this young comic are going on their separate tours, and he's helping the young comic in various ways. And the young comic tries out material on him, and he offers this joke, and Seinfeld nods very soberly and goes, yeah, that's funny. But has no amusement whatsoever. And I think some of us, we're capable of making that assessment as well, where we're just judging the kind of formal properties of a joke and said, yes, I recognize that, but they're not amused by it. That's what I want to say is incompatible. They're not, or maybe I should say this, that if it's a joke about something else, right? That's a way of trying to distract people in a kind of, not illegitimate, but that's not the kind of way that I'm interested in. You're getting them to laugh, and there is a psychological incompatibility with being angry. What I'm interested in are the cases in which we're able to laugh about this and the very same properties that you're angry at, or at least the larger set of properties, the disparity between reality and pretensions and reality. And so that's a different way of distracting. It's a way of getting us both into the more reflective step back move in which the anger just, it does dissolve because there's a different kind of evaluation that's going on. That's actually helpful. So I need to think about the kinds of specific kinds of amusement that are pertinent to this project, and they have to be pertinent to the actual dispute. Yeah. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, Laura and then Collis.
Okay, cool. So I have two slightly related small questions. So the first is why is it that you're saying that humor communicates that whatever we're laughing or joking about doesn't matter so much, as opposed to, yes, it matters, but we have to take a different attitude towards it than the one we're taking. So I feel like that would explain better the kind of dark humor of, like, you know, people who work in like medicine and stuff, because they don't think it doesn't matter. They think it matters, but they think that their purposes in bringing about like all the valuable stuff can best be reached by taking a different attitude. So I think that would also nicely explain why some types of humor can end quarrels. The second question that's kind of related is, I feel like your definition of a quarrel is like super collaborative. Like it's got this, we're both disagreeing about stuff, but I want you to empathize with me, and I want to do the same for you. And like, but many fights, maybe you don't want to call them quarrels, and they're outside of your, of the scope of your talk, but which is fine. But just like lots of fights aren't that collaborative. And I guess this is related to my previous question in the sense that I can see how, like, in those kinds of fights, if humor is indeed like based on this kind of idea that we should like take a detached attitude and not care about it so much, I can see how humor in this kind of fight that I'm describing is going to be super counterproductive because when things aren't collaborative, people like don't want to let go of their attitude in order to reach whatever consensus with the person that they're angry with. Yeah, so I guess there's just the 2 points, like the point about humor and also its role in fights that aren't as collaborative as you described.
Yeah, great questions that I thank you very much. So the point about let's say the first responders who are laughing or making wisecracks about people who come into the ER, say, spurting blood. And they don't, of course, think that the person before them doesn't matter. And what they're doing is distracting away from the emotional distress. Now, what's going on there is not to say that what's happening here doesn't matter. What's instead is going on here is, man, how funny would it be if it turns out that all this stuff that we're doing here turns out not to matter. So it's not nihilism, it's just the possibility that that's the case. And so that's, I think, where, at least when it comes to absurd humor, there may just be, dark humor cuts across a number of different categories, but when it's absurd and when it's pertaining to coping strategies, I think that's the kind of thing that gets you at arm's length from the emotional distress and allows you to focus on the task at hand. Because the task at hand really does matter, right? But this stuff that's going on here, well, how funny would it be if that's the idea, if it turns out that nothing matters. So that's one thought. And it's clear that, I mean, they think they come to your bedside afterwards and they're clearly dealing with you as a human being who has value, and they're not thinking that you have no value at all. When it comes to non-collaborative or non-mutual kinds of disagreements, you're right. There's a part of where I'm just insisting that the most interesting kinds of quarrels are the ones in which there's a kind of mutual understanding that we'd like to find a way out of this. And we'd like to do so through mutually agreeable ways. So there's a sense in which I can say, to the extent that you're just fighting with one another, you can do that with a psychopath, you can do that with a narcissist, and you're going to try to find some way out, maybe, and it doesn't have to be collaborative, it doesn't have to have this mutually satisfactory ending. But the reason I'm thinking of quarrels here, I'm taking the framework that Strawson gives kind of seriously and say that you can only quarrel with someone who's within the participant attitude, and within the participant stance. And to take that stance with other people requires being emotionally vulnerable, not just to anger, but a variety of kinds of these engaged reactive attitudes. And I think the larger story is to be vulnerable to that array of reactive attitudes does require a kind of assumption that you and I, we view each other as normative equals. And so to the extent we view each other as normative equals, we ought to proceed in a way that respects the other person. And so there's something about being in the participant stance that requires a kind of collaboration and cooperation. I'm just kind of taking that on board. But thank you very much for those questions.
I've got Carlos and then John.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I answered the question about the incompatibility of anger and amusement. So it's a slightly different case of Paul. So Paul's case, I take it, is someone who is angry and then is amused. But I was thinking, could there be cases where you are angry that you are amused? So, your enemy and you are both in front of a group of mutual friends, and it just turns out your enemy is funnier than you are. Yeah. And you're amused by your enemy. Yeah. Not just that you judge that what they say could be seen as amusing, you actually find it amusing. But you could also be therefore angry that you find it amusing because they one-upped you yet again. And that seems even harder for you because it's not just that you're angry and amused, angry that you're amused. So do you take it that kind of case is like a conceptual impossibility or something like that? Or?
No, I think that's perfectly conceptually possible. And that's one of those cases where I think it cuts against the people who just want to say it's just a psychological incompatibility, because I think you're exactly right. That I can be in these states simultaneously. I can be amused by something and angry that I'm amused by something. But notice that the objects are different. So I'm amused at these events out here in the world, and I'm angered at my attitude towards those events out in the world. And so those are perfectly possible, become possible. What I'm saying is conceptually problematic and maybe impossible is to evaluate the very same properties as both mattering and not mattering, which is what I think they do. I lived in New Orleans for many years, and we had neighbors who were just awful. I mean, worst neighbors we ever had. They were running a furniture business out of their drive. Anyway, I don't want to go into all the details, but we had some serious back and forths with each other, very angry. And I started getting these postcards in the mail that were advertisements for retirement communities out in the country. And for a while I said, what the hell is happening here? And then I put it together. I said, oh, that's funny. And I'm really pissed off that I'm amused by this. But there, in a way, it kind of softened we had a kind of rapprochement. But nevertheless, at the time, that was the thing that was going on. But I was angry at my amusement. My amusement was at him. Thanks.
Got John, I've got Ruben in the queue. I'll be next. Go ahead, John.
So I wanted to ask about the thing you said right at the end, which was about how tricky successful quarrel ending humor is. And the thing you were worried about, I think it was, you want to have the stepping back thing so that you can see the absurdity in the the distance between how seriously you're taking it and how little it matters, or it doesn't matter at all. But you don't want to lose the but you still matter part. And then there's a worry that once you step back, there's no stopping.
Yeah.
And maybe this is just partly because I've never felt like just even like the tiniest grip of non-listen at all. So I struggle with the whole stepping all the way back thing. But it seems to me like part of a successful versions of the quarrel ending humor presuppose, or they depend on the participants in the quarrel sharing some sense of the things, some hierarchy or ordered sense of the things that matter. And if they don't, it's going to be really hard to execute the quarrel ending humor. Yeah. So what matters is that my wife and I have a shared understanding that like our argument about the dishes or something is small potatoes, right, compared to like, our lifelong plans to, raise a family and et cetera, right? Those things really do matter.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas if we had no shared background hierarchy of what really matters, then it does look like there's a risk of kind of spinning right out.
Yeah.
I just want to know whether you think that's right.
Yeah, I think that is right. What I'm doing is inviting you to share a kind of perspective with me, which you're not going to be able to do if you think what we're arguing about is not small potatoes, but gigantic potatoes. Like, I don't know what the opposite would be. It really is a big deal, and it's the thing that has structured our relationship. It's constitutive of the relationship that we're in, maybe. And I think if that's what I'm backing away from, we've got a problem. We've got a serious problem here. So I agree. So are you suggesting then that you think that it's, well, given that you're not even tempted by the nihilism or the step back move as yielding a kind of worry about nihilism, then this is the kind of thing that we can do, that we're pointing out that this little dispute that we're having doesn't mean much at all in the larger.
But there has to be.
But there's a fixed.
Yeah.
So I see. So this is a way in which it's in fact not stable. It's, if you're focusing on the right sort of thing, it's incredibly stable and kind of bonding in a way. It reminds us what does matter about our relationship. I think that's right. I think that is right. Yeah. That's all I have to say. You win. Yeah, that's good. That's good. And I'm sorry, I run across people who are not moved at all by the Nagel argument, and so this is one way to hack at it. Good, thanks.
I remind those of you who are my 270 students who are here that all kinds of questions are appropriate, and it's a great space to ask all kinds of follow-ups. And I want to model that by sort of asking a little bit, that you go back to a little bit of the first two kinds of humor, the kinds that enhance your well-being, the affiliative and the self-enhancing, named kind of humor. And of course, in the title of the talk, we have wisecracks set up with dissolving tension or conflict, and the wisecracking sort of fits into that first category.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted you to come back and clarify for us where we stand at the end with respect to these two kinds. Is it that both of these kinds of humor can play the same role? In that it just turns out that we can think, if we think about it from a conceptual point of view rather than an experimental point of view, we can see there's a single mechanism that would underwrite what both of these would be helpful.
Yeah, so I think they both can serve, thank you, because this allows me to say some things that I should have said and I didn't. I think both of them can serve as to dissolve the quarrel. But I think that the affiliative humor is more along the lines of the dog vomiting on the carpet and the call from the distressed daughter, that they end the quarrel for now because I've now been put into a psychological state that is more or less not quite compatible with remaining in the angered state. But you've gotten there through a kind of shared history that we've got. I mean, maybe. So you've got a thwart story you could tell maybe, but I'll leave that for you to do. But there's maybe my wife and I are lovers of Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Again, this is an ancient movie for most of you. And I asked my wife a question, well, what do you think about that? And she just responds in stony silence, and I say, Bueller, Bueller, Bueller. This is the kind of thing that could get you to laugh at it and get her amused, but it's not the kind of thing that's going to eliminate or get you down necessarily the reasons route to getting out of the quarrel, because it's not about the quarrel. So what I find particularly fascinating about the absurdist humor is it can be about the quarrel. And it's a way of laughing at how seriously we're taking this thing that's not so serious in the grand scheme of things. So I think they do end them in different kinds of ways.
That's helpful, because I wasn't clear at the end whether you were saying it was the same or different. In a way, you're saying that the one that's hard testing experimentally, the self-enhancing actually can be more.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So for me, as I was listening to it, we talked about this example over lunch today, where my wife and I have a kind of pattern. Sometimes it'll happen, and it used to happen that sometimes she would start to get frustrated with why I was doing something, and she would feel like I was really at fault for it, or she'd be torn between interpretation where I'm sort of well-meaning but I'm really stupid, and alternative interpretation where maybe I'm just really, as she would say, trying to thwart her.
Yeah.
She'd say, why are you thwarting me? And so in the last year or so, parts as we've been talking about your talk topic, I will sometimes, as she starts to get anxious about something, I will say, well, really, dear, I'm just trying to thwart you. And in our relationship, in the context of her accusing me of being the bad guy who's just trying to thwart her, I preempt it by sort of teasing her that that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
And I wasn't sure which of these categories that fell into.
Yeah.
Like when we were talking about it at lunch, I was thinking that it was wisecracking because it's very situation sensitive. It really depends on this history of our relationship. Really to sort of get why it would be sort of disarming. You sort of have to understand the role that had played. But on the other hand, it is sort of a little bit self-deprecating.
I think it is.
It's like I'm owning in a way that like this, like am I? Maybe I've been the bad guy sometime. Maybe this is. But then I also don't wonder whether there's this extra third thing going on, maybe sometimes, which is that you talked about the role of humor in sort of navigating what facilitating the norms are.
Yeah.
And one thing that happens often when sort of relationships or quarrels heat up is that we're sort of torn between multiple interpretations, or like it's like open to us that the other person is more of a bad actor. And maybe I feel like maybe I'm enforcing the norm of not interpreting these.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Interpretation. Let's just like set aside that interpretation. Let's make fun of you for interpreting me in the most uncharitable way.
Yeah.
In order to sort of enforce the norm that we not do that.
Yeah.
And that might not be a little bit different from both of us as well.
Well, and so maybe serving all three simultaneously. That there's this affiliative kind of joshing here, but there's also self-deprecation, and there's also urging subtly and comically to interpret me in a different kind of way. I was also thinking it could count, there's a kind of absurdity there in using dramatic kind of conflict language to apply to, say, a mundane kind of dispute. So that's just pointing out a certain kind of disparity that could also be funny. So you're quadruply funny, Mark.
Do we have a question from online? Go ahead, Matt.
Right, so Matt King is saying that
Matt King.
he really enjoyed your talk. And also he's asking, Strawson told us the participant stance is in some sense inescapable, but implicit in his discussion, or of his devotees, is that there is value in the participant stance, at least insofar as we wouldn't want to escape it. And then he says, from that perspective, is anger, or being open to it, something close to a necessary feature of the participant stance, and would quarreling without anger to the extent that it's a participatory activity be deficient quarreling in some way?
All right. Thanks, Matt. So I'm not sure everybody heard this, but so the thought is that it looks like, well, I may need to actually reread the beginning part. Can you do that?
Yeah, of course.
Please.
So Strawson says that the participant stance is in some sense inescapable.
Yeah, okay.
But implicit in the discussion, or of his devotees, is that it's also valuable, so that there is value to participants.
That's right. Yeah, good. So so on the one hand, Strawson says that this is the kind of default stance we're in with one another, and it is. There's a way in which it's kind of inescapable, although we can escape it. We have a special resource, he says, in which case, in cases of stress, I can't, or the strains of involvement, he calls it, we can step away and we can go to the objective attitude. So it is something that we can go back and forth between, although we may not be able to hold on to the objective attitude with one another for very long. So what do we say about the role of anger here in quarreling? And I want to insist that it's the quarreling is the sharp edge, and the participant stance provides just simply emotional vulnerability. So I'm thinking of quarreling as one in which anger of a certain sort is a necessary component. And so in part because it's evaluating things here as what matters. And so given that it's a necessary component of quarrels, to the extent we can offer absurdist humor, we can get out of those things as a result of viewing the thing that we're arguing over as not mattering anymore. So I don't think it's inescapable. I don't think any of these, that's another thing that I want to press, is that I don't think any of the particular stances are inescapable, not the objective or the participant, and not the engaged or the reflective. It's just that we can't sustain them, the objective and the reflective, for very long. I hope that addresses the issue. If he's got a follow-up, I'd be happy to.
All right, well, we'll wait and see if Matt has a follow-up. I have Jen.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm like all the way here. So thanks very much for this talk. I thought it was super compelling. So I'm thinking a case that makes me think maybe like another dimension of the absurdist picture to also include, which is not necessarily wisecracking, but like situational absurdity. So it's kind of telling that I don't actually remember what we were arguing about. But in high school, my sister and I were both on the varsity volleyball team. We went to practice, every day. We got into some quarrel, and we get to practice, and we have to warm up together, and we always warmed up with each other, always. And so the way we do that is we throw the ball, you hit the ball, we start just like slamming the ball. Like it just making, just echoing throughout the gym, like it's to the point where we both just like crack up. Because it's just ridiculous what we're doing. What's kind of interesting about the situation is we were like forced to not deal with the fact that we were quarreling by like having to do this shared activity, but it's like using the activity as an outlet was like kind of aggressive. So maybe it wasn't aggressive. I really think what was funny about it was how absurd it was. But I just wanted to like throw that case at you. See what you thought about it.
So I think you're great. I think that's great, and I think that's a really interesting case because it's not a deliberate attempt on anybody's part to appeal to the absurd, but nevertheless the absurd was revealed, and the absurd was revealed in how very angry and upset and loud you're being relative to the small potatoes of the disagreement that you're having, and so that's really helpful because it's not just what I do or say in which you can realize the absurd, but it's the events of life that can reveal to us how absurd things are. And that may be the case with the dog vomiting on the rug, I suppose, Or certainly when my daughter calls and she's distressed, that may force me to realize in the sobering way that, oh my, this is the thing that really matters here, and we should just move off of this silliness. So there are a variety of things that could go on, but yeah, it's a nice case. Thanks.
I've got some thoughts here about like the way that political comics have kind of been a big part of, there's like political campaigning and stuff for quite a long time. And it seems like there's a way in which you think about like political battles, they can be like, we hope sometimes there are reasons responsive and there's a kind of quarreling aspect to them. But it also seems to me like the political comics are usually pretty sharp, and they rarely seem successful at dissolving the quarrel or at enforcing the kind of norms that maybe certain norm entrepreneurs want to arise. I'm like wondering why you think this is the case. Is it that there's a lack of being on the same team that's happening here? Like we can't affiliate with one another. Like does that mean that these things aren't best understood as quarrels? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to think about that. That's really good. So getting into political humor muddies the waters. There's a sense in which she's gone, but they're not on the same team, the two sides, in a way that they're not open to mutually satisfactory ways of ending the divide. But I'm also, man, I didn't think I was going to have to talk about this, but when going to what makes things funny, I'm a Humean, and so think that it has something very much to do with, we have to make essential reference to our senses of humor. But it's not just whatever our senses of humor deliver, it's got to be well-developed, refined, and unobstructed senses of humor. So our view of the relevant properties has to be unobstructed. And I think politics is the domain in which every side has their view obstructed. And this comes out when people say of Dennis Miller after 9/11, when he seemed to switch teams and go to the conservative side of the map, they said, Dennis Miller, why did he stop being funny? And the truth of the matter is he didn't. It's just that his particular political leanings were coming from the other side, right? If you look at the formal structure of his jokes when he was on Saturday Night Live, they are identical to the kind of political jokes, conservative-based political jokes that he was making. So I think that these ideological obstructions also prevent people from seeing all sorts of humor. Political comedians are coming from a particular side very often. The best ones are the ones that can somehow navigate the middle, and there's very, very few who can do that. But if you're coming from one side or another, then it's just rallying the team around you against them, and that's not going to help anything, I think.
Can I follow up on that question?
question about the sort of aspects of humor. So like on the slide, you sort of talk through how it is that there are a lot of theories that authors have offered about what makes jokes funny or what makes anything funny.
Yeah.
And you sort of listed a bunch of them without sort of saying very much about what those said. And then you endorsed a kind of, maybe not pluralism, but at least a sort of resistance that any of those captures it all by itself.
Yeah.
And yet, as we sort of got more and more into the sort of the role of the absurd in sort of the kind of detachment that allows us to sort of step back from the emotions, it felt to me like part of what you were saying there is that there's this kind of incongruity between the detached perspective and the sort of engaged perspective that is sort of at the heart of what's coming, that's sort of pulling those two things together and juxtaposing this.
Yes, I think that's right.
In the absurd light.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that was sort of like getting us too close for what you wanted to, with respect to what's, like, is that a particular kind of humor then that involves incongruity? Because incongruity sounded like it was among the kinds of things that people have offered as being very general features of humor, and you didn't want to say that.
No, I don't want to say that. Incongruity is the leading theory of humor. In terms of monistic theories, people think that, so incongruity is very generally mismatch between expectations and reality. And absurd humor is a type of incongruity humor. The problem is that it's all of these theories that I put up are just rife with counterexamples from both sides. There's false positives and there's false negatives. And so incongruity in a Salvador Dali painting isn't funny. Or I expect when I come home for everything to be fine and I find my wife and dog murdered. That's not funny, not funny. Totally incongruous. Right. And there may be so some theorists retreat and say, well, at least incongruity has to be necessary to every case of humor, and that's when they start fancy dancing by expanding the notion of what incongruity is to be all-inclusive, and it becomes empty as something that's a helpful theoretical explanation. And I think there are plenty of cases of humor that don't involve any incongruity. Some impersonations can be dead on and be hilarious as a result of that. The two 7-year-old boys laughing hilariously at the sound of the ketchup bottle making a farting sound. And that little bit of humor may be incongruity, but my laughter at their laughter is not incongruous, because that's exactly what 7-year-old boys do. So, and I can just go through each of those theories and point out why. They're all capturing something. They're all getting something, but they don't tell the whole story, and they're not telling a necessary condition story. And so one way to go is just to list all of the properties. I call it the kitchen sink theory of humor, and just list all the properties, and something like that is probably true, but it doesn't deliver the goods on when superiority mixed with incongruity in this way is funny, and what makes them funnier. There's all these things that are still missing from the account, and so what I want to say is, okay, what makes these properties, when they are funny makers, appeal to the internal sensibility?
Let me ask one more question. So you distinguish between the sort of engaged and the sort of removed stances, and distinguish that from the object and the participant stances in Strawson. I guess I want to ask you whether there's a relationship between those two pairs. They're both pairs. One of them is in both cases, there's a kind of metaphor of stepping back and being there. Sometimes, the participants engage. Sometimes those words come together to describe the participant's stance. So I wonder if you do think there's a relationship between the two, or if they're just orthogonal.
Yeah, good. So I think that for going Strawsonian about the participant stance, this is the stance in which we view each other as mattering. And it matters what attitudes you have towards me. And so there's something here about respect, not slighting others, not treating them with a certain kind of malice. So I think the Strawsonian participant stance is about our stance relative to each other, whereas I think the Hegelian engaged stance is about our relation to values. So that we have various kinds of things that matter to us, and they provide us with reasons. So there's a sense in which there's a slight overlap between the participant and the engaged stance when the object of my value is you, or my fellow members of the moral community. But not when it comes to just things that matter to me generally. And so that's why I'm worried about the instability of the partial step back or the local step back, because of that overlap, because among the things that I value are my fellows. And so, and then the objective stance is to say, is with respect to other people. So the contrast is with being emotionally vulnerable people, and their attitudes matter to me, and I step back from that, and they don't matter to me, or I'm not going to take them seriously. But the Hegelian reflective stance has to do with all of the values, not just the value of other people. So they're partially overlapping, but I think different in interesting ways. But what's also interesting is I had a grad student who wrote a dissertation, a very close reading of Strawson and Nagel, and he thinks that they thought the two stances were overlapping and identical, basically. So most of the time, Nagel talks about a subjective versus objective stance, and so there's a thought in which that resonates with objective versus participant stance. And then in this paper, he's talking about reflective and engaged, and those are supposed to map onto, I think, the subjective and the objective for him. So I think they thought they were identical, but they're not, I think.
Please join me in thanking Dave Shoemaker.
Thank you. Thanks very much.